Welcome back to the CSO YouTube channel. My name is Mauzy and we are back with some more. Welcome to Starcraft 2 series, and we are on to episode number 2. We're going to talk about the 3 playable races. First of all, let me thank you for returning. I really appreciate it. That means I kind of sparked some of the interest that can be sparked here, and I'm really happy for that. Okay, let's jump right into it. First race that we're going to talk about is Terran, and this is the human high-tech race that actually uses futuristic technology to outfit their army. We're going to have a set structure to deal with the some of these things that need to explain for each race. We're going to talk about workers, how you increase your supply, aka population, your main buildings, your production facilities, some upgrades. If there's anything specific to the race, we're going to talk about that. And lastly but not least, we're going to talk about unit compositions. All right. First, let's talk about the SCVs that are your working units. There's 2 main resources that need to be mined, and the third one is the supply that needs to be increased with the specific building, the supply depot. SCVs will mine the minerals, the blue stuff, and the Vespin gas, the green stuff. And they will also build your buildings. They need to actually stay on the building site until the building is finished, because otherwise you can pull it off, but the building is not going to be finished. SCVs can also repair mechanical structures and units, so it's useful to know about that. Your main structure, that is, as I mentioned, will increase your supply next to the supply depot, can be actually outfitted with 2 upgrades. One of them is probably the easier one. You only need an engineering bay, and you can morph it into a planetary fortress. The planetary fortress is used usually in the late game for later stages, let's say for an outer base that is harder to reach, just to buy a bit of time. It attacks ground units, and it's a really good tool to have defensively. The other one that is important for the macro cycle is going to be the orbital command center that has 3 abilities, but we're going to talk about 2 of them, which are the most important in my opinion. First, it's going to be the call down mule, which will call down a super SCV that is exclusively mining minerals, but it's not going to disrupt any of the SCVs, as we like to call it. They have longer hands, so they can reach from behind the SCVs. No matter how funny that sounds, it is a really powerful tool. It is a timer based unit, so you need to make it count. So these also, by the way, these also can repair. That is an important thing. The second ability of the orbital command center is going to be the sweeper scan. This is used to scout your opponent. If you really want to know something about a specific location, for example, you just drop a scan there and it will reveal everything, including invisible units. All 3 races have detectors, which can be structures or units. Detectors offer you true sight. True sight means it will detect every single invisible unit. The scan acts as a detector as well, based on a pretty decent duration in my opinion. You can actually use it to fight some of the cloaked units of your opponents. Let's talk about the production facilities. You have your barracks for your infantry, you have your factory for your ground vehicles, and your starport for your air vehicles. This is self-explanatory in my opinion. It's really easy to know what unit you need, what production facility you need to search for if you want an infantry unit, a ground mechanical vehicle, or a air unit. Other than that, these can be outfitted with add-ons, for example reactors or tech labs. Well, not for example, these are the only 2. So reactors will allow the non-tech lab requiring units to be produced in pairs from that specific production facility, and the tech lab will unlock those tech lab requiring units, and they also will unlock, depending on which production facility they are on, specific upgrades for some of those higher tech units. Other than that, when it comes to upgrades, you have your engineering bay, which will help you get armor and attack upgrades for your infantry, as well as the armory that has the upgrades, the same upgrades for your vehicles, be it ground or air. All right, now that we have that out of the way, one last thing that we need to talk about regarding the add-ons and the command center / production facilities. These buildings can lift, meaning that, for example, the command center, unless it's a planetary fortress, can be lifted, or first of all can be built on the high ground, and then when it's safe you can actually lift it and land it to your next base. Same goes with the production facilities, but it is more important to note that these are going to be lifted mostly because of add-on switches. There's going to be times when you want a specific add-on on a different production facility, and then you can just lift both buildings and exchange their positions. It is a simple mechanic, but you actually need to be in time. You need to calculate everything. You need to time your production to be constructed at the right time, so you don't have too much downtime, because Terran wants to produce each moment if possible. Regarding playstyles, there's two major playstyles. First of all, we have Bio, which is going to consist of infantry, mostly supported by medevacs that can heal these infantry units, the biological units, but possibly a couple of mechanical units, for example widow mines or siege tanks, to provide some extra splash firepower, and possibly anti-air in the forms of Vikings, or some more ground support in form of liberators, or even like detectors like or spellcasters like the Raven or the Ghost. The Ghost is also a infantry unit, but it's more of a late game type of thing. Bio is about fast-paced, multi-pronged, like multi-location harassment. You can use the medevacs not only to heal, but you can actually transport your units in it. So it's really good to pick up, drop into a location that is unprotected by your enemy. Thus you can gain an advantage. The other one is going to be the mech playstyle. Mech playstyle is broken down into two separate styles. First of all, you have your battle mech, which is kind of similar to Bio. You just have fast skirmishing vehicles that can take a fight. They can move fast, they can harass, they can make good trades while you macro up behind it. Use your money, you spend it, yada yada yada. And you have your turtle mech. When you stay at home, you try to defend until you reach maximum supply, aka 200 out of 200. You try to expand and you try to grab a army that is pretty much unbeatable, which is called a death ball type of strategy. Basically, you are going to focus on units like the Tor and the siege tanks, which are really high damage output but slowly moving unit types. You can outfit them with different supportive units or spellcasters, but that's going to be the base of it. Once you get going with the standard turtle mech, you're going basically. You move across the map and kill your opponent. That's basically your timing. All right, that's pretty much it, what you need to know about Terran. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, the next one is going to be Zerg. Zerg is pretty much the evolving reactionary race that is really fast-paced. You actually need to make good decisions in order to make this race work, at least in my opinion. So yeah, let's dive into it. We have a bit of a more complicated tech tree, but don't worry, we'll debunk it and we're gonna be safe, and we're gonna start out safe with Zerg as well. Okay, the workers are called drones, and first of all, let's talk about that Zerg is actually starting on creep. This means everything except for the drone will gain movement speed, and they need to build their buildings except for the main building, the hatchery, on creep. This is an important aspect that you need to know right out of the gate. It's pretty much like undead in Warcraft 3 if you're familiar with that. Okay, so drones, they need to actually morph into the building, meaning they are sacrificing their own lives to become that building. That is kind of a night elf concept, once again, if you're familiar with it. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Every single worker you pull off the mineral line or the worker line, basically, you need to replace it at some point. so you need to be careful. How you replace it though? Well, that's what your main building is for. This is going to produce everything out of larva. What is larva? Larva is shown in the top right side of this tech tree. It's going to produce every single unit. Zerg works a bit different from the other races. It doesn't use production facilities. You have your main building that will produce everything, and surprise, the supply producing structure is not a structure but a unit. It's called the Overlord. It is also produced from larva. Everything except from the queen that is produced directly from the hatchery is going to cost larva. Larva is the extra resource that is added to Zerg, so Zerg has quote-unquote 4 resources, if you want to call it that. That specific fourth is the larva. Overlords are your supply producing flying units that are moving slowly, but they are really good to scout in the early game. Usually you send your first overlord across the map, then the second, third, fourth will be spread around your base to scout for any aggression in the early game. As I mentioned, Zerg is depending on good decisions. Why is that? Because once you get some buildings that are going to unlock they are called strains. Basically, you unlock the blueprint for the larva to turn into a specific unit. And that requires a couple of steps. For example, you can evolve your main building, the hatchery, into a lair, and later on into a hive. This requires also a set of specific buildings, but it will unlock higher tech units. We call them tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, or hatchery tech, lair tech, or hive tech units. Okay. What I also need to tell you that the queen is the main thing in the Zerg army. It will actually help you produce more larva and spread the creep. It has, let me show you, it has 2 basic abilities that are going to be super useful. There's one called Transfuse, which you can also use as a healing tool, but the first 2 are going to be your mainly used abilities. Spawn larva will inject the hatchery, and after 29 seconds of wait time, you are going to see 3 extra larvae popping off. The hatchery produces larvae passively, but you can actually add every 29 seconds 3 extra larvae. You cannot stack these. You can basically queue up injects, which means you can inject 2 times, one after the other, or with 2 queens, and it will actually allow you to skip the next inject timing. That is something that it's not going to happen at the pro level, but it's going to happen a lot at our level. Okay, the other one is creep tumors. Creep tumors are used to spread the creep. The queen lays down a creep tumor. The creep tumor can spread once each tumor, then it will become active. The creep tumors are cloaked. The enemy needs detection to clear it. You have vision on creep as well as movement speed, as I mentioned. So you actually want to spread the creep as further as possible, as far away from your main base to actually be aware of every single attack. Be aware when the opponent steps on creep, so you can react. As I said, Zerg is reactionary. One more important decision is when to make drones and when to make units. The ideal scenario is you get up to a specific amount of drones, which can be from 80 to 100. Yes, Zerg works with a lot of workers, has probably the best economy in the game if you can just get it rolling, and then starts producing units, combat units, if you have, of course, the required tech building for it. It's important to not over drone or under drone. What these mean? Well, basically, if you over drone, it means that an attack is coming and you're producing drones, which are not good at fighting, trust me, and you're gonna die to it. If you're under droning, means that you're not getting enough economy to sustain more than one attack, and if that attack gets held, then you're basically done. You're behind economically, and you most possibly need to produce units once again, but those are not going to be as many as they were before, and the counterattack is coming. So you really need to be careful with your decisions. The queen is going to help because it can actually use it in combat as well. She moves really slow off creep, and they cannot use their transfuse, their healing ability off creep, but they are really good ranged units that can attack both ground and air. All right, regarding upgrades, Zerg is pretty much the most fascinating. They have your standard attack and armor upgrades, which are called, they're separate for the melee and ranged units, but they have a common carapace, for example. Same with the air. They have air upgrades, just like Turn has the armory for the air vehicles. Basically, what you need to know that Zerg, it has a lot of upgrades, meaning most of them are speed upgrades or range upgrades, and some of them can actually transform into more powerful units. Let's go back to the Zerg tech tree, and you can see all of these. Let me just remove my camera. You can see the morphed units. So, for example, Zerglings can morph into Bailings, suicide units, which come in contact and they explode when came in contact with the enemy. Roaches morph into Ravagers, which are really good siege units in my opinion. They have corrosive bile, which is really nice if you stack them up. You have the Hydralisk that can morph into a Lurker. If that burrows, it becomes cloaked, so the enemy needs detection, and it's a really good siege unit. It just attacks in a line, but hits everything in a line. And you have the Corruptor that can morph into a Broodlord. The Corruptor is anti-air, the Broodlord is anti-ground. That spawns free units, basically, time-based units that are going to attack exclusively on the ground. They move slow, but if protected, they can do massive damage. And last but not least, the Overlords can also be outfitted with speed upgrades called Pneumatized Carapace, which actually makes them even better to scout, but they can also be morphed into a detector called the Overseer, or something that can transport and drop units called, well, we call it a Dropper Lord. Yeah, that's pretty much about the evolvement of Zerg. As I mentioned, it's really about reaction. In the late game, if you have all these tech units, tech buildings, sorry, then you are going to be able to transition your tech, your unit composition really easily. So once you get a hang of it, it's going to be super, super nice. Regarding unit compositions, we have basically two main, in my opinion, and those can be outfitted or varied between each other. First, it's going to be Lingbane, the other one is Roach Ravager. Lingbane is pretty much the bread and butter of every Zerg pro player. It is a really fast trading based unit composition that moves super fast on creep. That's probably the disadvantage. You kind of need to learn to spread the creep pretty fast. But these are cheap units that can be replaced pretty fast. They morph fast, so a lot can be done with it, basically while saving up for an additional tech transition. The other one, the Roach Ravager, is probably the easier one in terms of execution, because this doesn't require too much micro like Lingbane, doesn't need that much creep spread, and it's actually a beefier, well, higher attack damage type of composition, and it usually serves as the bread and butter of us noobs. Alright, one actual transition that you can do is, for example, you can add Mutalisks, Hydralisks, or Hydra Lurker, or like, I don't know, Mutas, Corruptors, and all that stuff. Mutalisks are air units that can actually fly super fast. They are fighting pretty poorly, but they are really good at harassing, picking off reinforcements. Hydralisks are squishy units, but if protected and they have units to tank the damage for, then they are going to output a lot of damage. They are ranged and they can attack both air and ground, instead just the ground for the Roach Ravager. So the late game is probably based on Broodlords, Lurkers, aka tier 3 units, and these are going to be outfitted with spellcasters such as Infestors and Vipers. These both are basically battle spellcasters. They are efficient in battles. They need to get out there, they need to use their abilities properly, and yeah, basically these are super important units to have in your army. Alright, I think that's going to be it for the Zerg part. I hope I didn't miss anything. And yeah, if I missed anything, just ask your questions in the comments, just like with any other race, and I'll try to do my best to answer them. Let's move on to the next one. Alright, last but not least, we have the Protoss race. This is going to be the high-tech alien race that is going to be outfitted with small amount of units and high amounts of damage, pretty much. Compared to the other two races, these have shields that can passively regenerate, just like Zerg can regenerate HP and Terran can repair stuff. Their HP bars are lower to compensate for the amount of shield they have, so they are not invincible. Don't worry about it. The workers are similar to the other two races' workers. They can mine minerals and produce buildings. It's kind of the same for each race, right? Well, the main difference is Protoss actually can just start the building and let it finish by itself. There's a catch though. Everything except for the Nexus and the supply providing pylon needs to be built on power field. The power field is similar to creep and it's provided by the pylon itself. So basically how it works is you get a power field, you start the building. In the meantime, if the power field ceases to exist, the pylon is destroyed, the building will still finish, will still warp in, but it's going to be unpowered. It's going to be unusable. You need to repower it using another pylon's power field. So it's important to know where you place it, and it's more important to actually outfit your singular pylon with friends, so you don't get your massive amount of buildings just unpowered due to losing a single pylon. Okay, regarding the Nexus, this is outfitted with the most stuff, I think, right out of the gate. It has 3 spells. Chrono Boost can be used to speed up researches and unit production. Recall can be used to teleport units back to the Nexus that it's been casted from. And Battery Overcharge will, well, as it says, overcharge shield batteries and will regenerate shields much faster. They will not lose energy in the meantime, but they are limited to a certain amount of time. Important to note, your opponent might need to back off, but you need to be careful where to place your shield battery. You need to be sure that you want to use it because it has a cooldown, so it's not actually spammable. More important to note that the shield battery needs to be in range of the Nexus, and the Nexus has to needs to have the amount of energy, that 50 energy for each spell to cast it. So it's important, especially in the mid to late game stages, on what you want to burn that Nexus energy on. Alright, production facilities are going to be the Gateway, the Robotics Facility, and Stargate. These are pretty much the 3 tech paths that you can have, but we'll talk about it in just a moment. The Gateway by itself doesn't feature too much. You actually need a cybernetic score to unlock most of the units. The Zealot alone can be okay in the mid to late game stages, but it's not a really tough opponent to beat if it's not upgraded. The cybernetic score will unlock some more agile, more robust units, but most importantly will unlock the Warp Gate research, which can actually transform your gateways into warp gates, meaning that the warp gates now function as a kind of teleport call-in type of building, which means they can call in or warp in units, to be specific with the terminology, wherever there is power field. This can be provided by pylons, for example. And we'll talk about one more method when we talk about the robotics facility. But first of all, the cybernetic score will unlock the all three of the possible paths and playstyles. Let's just talk about those. The Twilight Council style, aka the Gateway style, why do we call it Gateway style? We'll see just in a second, will actually outfit gateway units, here's why it's called Gateway style, with some crucial upgrades. For example, Zealots gain the ability to charge at enemies, and Stalkers will get the ability to blink. This is kind of similar to Flash or Blink Dagger if you're a League of Legends or Dota player, if that makes any sense. It will also unlock the Templar tech. There's two types of Templars, High Templar and Dark Templar. We'll talk about these in just a moment. The importance is that these are basically tier 2/3 type of units. They are really powerful. High Templars, okay, you know what, let's just talk about them right now as we are at the Gateway style, because these come from the Gateway as well. High Templars have two powerful abilities. One of them is called Feedback. It will actually burn away the energy from energy-based units and deal damage to them based on that. The other ability is Psionic Storm. That is pretty much the most powerful spell for Protoss, in my opinion. It can basically evaporate squishy units, massive clumps of squishy units in no time if they don't pay attention, so it's really powerful. And the Dark Templars are actually invisible units that are, well, they are permanently cloaked. They have high damage, but they have low HP. How invisible units work in Starcraft is kind of different. I mentioned that you need detectors for basically dealing with them, to deal with them, but you can actually spot them. You cannot target them, but you can actually spot them, and you can potentially kill them without any detection using area of effect abilities, because there's a bit of shimmering on the screen. You'll see a bit of screen tearing where the invisible units are, if you pay enough attention. But yeah, of course, cloak units are going to be powerful in the beginning of each player's journey because it's a bit harder to deal with them. You actually need to be in position, you need to react fast, and Dark Templar is the most obnoxious out of all, in my opinion, and I say that as a Protoss main. One more important aspect, Templars, two Templars at the same time can actually morph into an Archon. The Archon is basically the beefiest unit, in my opinion, when it comes to HP and shields. It only has 10 HP but 350 shields, so it's really beefy. It has a decent attack. It's really good against biological units. It does bonus damage to them, and its attacks splash. It's a minimal splash, but it's a splash nonetheless. Now let's move on to the robotics facility style. The robo style features kind of the mech toss type of play style. You have massive, beefy, high firepower, splash dealing units from the robotics facility, and as well you can unlock a couple of them with the robotics bay. That also features a couple of upgrades. First, let's talk about the two supportive units in the not the robo bay, but the robo. First, we have the Observer, which is also a cloaked unit. It cannot attack, it's a flying unit, moves slowly, and it has something called observing mode, which will place it in a static position. It's a tiny bit easier to spot regarding that shimmering that I talked about, and it will actually increase the radius of the observer's sight range. It's also a detector. That is important to note. It can detect invisible units. There's also one thing. Remember I mentioned the warp in towards power fields, and I mentioned a different way of actually warping in gateway units without the usage of a pylon. The warp prism is not only the transport ship of the Protoss, but it's actually it actually can use something called phase mode, which turns it into a pylon. And now we have to talk about something that is specific regarding the power fields. There's two types of power fields. One of them will result in slow warp-ins, and one of them is called a warp conduit, which means it's going to be a much faster warp-in speed. This means that the pylon needs to be positioned rightfully somewhere where it's actually going to have a warp conduit in order to make it more efficient. This can be if the power field's edge basically is connected to a nexus, or if the power field actually features a warp gate, not a gateway, but a warp gate. The warp prism has a warp conduit basically from the get-go. It's important to note, just a bit of a trick, you can repower unpowered buildings that lost their pylon with the warp prism as well. And you can also use them to basically pick up a couple of units, drop it to a different location, use a massive warp-in, and there you go. You have two separate armies, for example. And that can be game-winning in my opinion, because you can catch your opponent off guard, and at least you can gain huge advantages. Okay, let's talk about the Stargate. This is probably the most controversial one, because SkyToss players that go straight away to the massive capital ships, aka when you see the fleet beacon dropping, you know that you're in for a treat. If you let these type of players max out, it's going to be just like Terran mech, the standard mech that we talked about. It's going to be a death ball that you most of the time cannot stop. It's going to move slowly, but it's a flying golden armada that is, well, basically, yeah, just nothing more to add. It's a death ball. But not every Stargate opener means that it's going to be straight to SkyToss. There's the Phoenix, the Oracle, and the Void Ray. These are really good scouting wise, harassing wise, and defensive wise. All three of them can be both, basically. So yeah, it's important to have some kind of variety in the opener. The opener meaning the first few minutes of the game, deciding your tech. This is probably the most impactful with Protoss, in my opinion. All right, I think we actually talked about everything. Well, as I look at my camera, it's already dark here. So yeah, as you can see, it takes a lot of time to make these videos, but trust me, I'm really happy that I managed to get these done. And yeah, I'm really happy that you stuck around. I will be more happy, or happier rather, if you would just stick around tomorrow, as we are going to talk about the game modes. We talk about campaign, co-op, versus, and the famous arcade mode. So yeah, stay tuned, stay safe. This is Mauzy and CSO Esports, and we wish you nothing but the best. Cheers.